All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Kevin Corinth, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Center for Opportunity and Social Mobility at the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome to Free the Economy, Kevin.
All right, thanks for having me on.
So, social welfare policy, I feel like, has always been controversial in the United States, even in a much earlier era when it was mostly provided by churches and voluntary community organizations. There were always a lot of questions about who deserved or was owed what level of assistance with things like food, housing, medical care. And the and moving to a system, a sort of modern system where most of that is funded by taxpayer dollars has not made that any less controversial. It's probably fair to say. So just to start, we're going to get into some like recent specific research, but just to start out with sort of like a big picture here, as someone who deals with this a lot, what do you think are the major kind of camps or schools or positions when it comes to how federal and state governments should be handling social welfare policy? Like, where are the kind of battle lines drawn in this debate today?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great place to start. I and many others sometimes get really focused in on outcomes and the effects of different interventions on different people. But I think at the end of the day, it's really important to clarify what are the different values that drive people into different positions. So I think on the one hand, you have people probably more associated with the left that think of it sort of as a sort of a social justice issue. Any person, regardless of their maybe behavior, or certainly for kids, regardless of the behavior of their parents, they should be able to meet their basic needs in terms of food and healthcare, and even some other cash assistance. So I think there's that view that sort of animates much of the left. I think more a view associated more with the right is one of sort of fairness, I guess, that, like if you expect to be, to have assistance provided to you by taxpayers or even other voluntary organizations, there's some quid pro quo, right? There's something that you have to give back, show that you're making an effort, so that you're showing that, like, look, I'm not just freeloading off of this system. I'm doing the best that I can. And there's sort of this expectation that people should be trying to work and try to better their lives on their own so that they don't need that assistance forever.
Yeah, and this is a topic, sort of an angle that's come up on some of our previous interviews as well, whereas with a lot of more progressive left policy advocates, they want to see budgets grow for social welfare agencies, for anti-homelessness interventions. They want to see those budgets grow, those programs grow, because then they're helping more people. But in the long run, and certainly this is the more conservative side of it, in the long run, we should want a sort of a flourishing economy in which people don't need that assistance, in which in the longest possible term it declines to zero, right? That would be the ideal, not a situation in which it increases ever all the time. And I wonder if there's a sort of tension between that. In the short term, there's people that we can't help with the budget we have now, and so we want to increase it a little bit so we can help those additional people, as opposed to, well, 100 years from now, if we're just dreaming, we're just having some blue sky dreaming here, we would like a social welfare system that almost no one has to take advantage of because they're able to support themselves.
Yeah. I mean, I think empirically that is certainly true, right? Like economic growth over the long run is by far the best thing you can do for people in poverty. And that's demonstrated not only in the United States, but pretty much every country in the world, that as you get more development, more economic growth, that means everybody's better off, including the poor and probably especially the poor. And I think there's a pretty wide recognition of that empirical fact, including on the left. Where I think some tension sometimes comes in is that there's sort of this belief that, yeah, like one, you do want to address people's short-term needs, but some people bought into this idea that addressing some of those short-term needs might even pay off in the long run. Like if you provide more resources to people in poverty, lack of cash is the thing that's keeping them out of the labor market, that's preventing their kids from developing and becoming thriving when they're adults. And really, we should view the safety net as sort of this investment into human capital that'll then pay off in the long run. And I mean, there's certainly an argument that can potentially be true. Empirically, I think that's overplayed a lot. and people therefore sort of don't wrestle as much with that exact trade-off that I think we really do face, which is that, the more we invest in short-term solutions and not into underlying economic growth, and improving human capital in what I would say more realistic ways for low income kids, then we really do face that, and we get less growth because you have more taxes that have to be paid either today or in the future. That dampens growth, increases tax rates at some point, it increases investment and less growth. So I think we do need to seriously wrestle with that trade-off. I mean, I'm somebody who's willing to, I wouldn't go all the way and say no safety net, just let's grow the economy and that's it. But like, I think we need to have some, we have some, sacrifice to long-term growth by providing a safety net, but let's be cognizant that as we push that further, there is a real trade-off there that will hurt people potentially in the future.
Well, yeah, and getting into the sort of objective case for where those, where we should make those trade-offs. I think, a lot of people have, not necessarily people who are the sort of policy experts in the area, but just a lot of people who are sort of Americans and observers of the scene have, opinions here that are guided either, explicitly by their religious beliefs or by just sort of a general moral intuition, right, about which social welfare policies are the best or the smartest or the most reasonable. But there, of course, there's a lot of people out there who say, well, that's all well and good to have those sort of like vague emotional responses to it, but we should be focusing on data and rigorous experimentation, right? And that's what should be guiding our spending priorities and about welfare programs and which ones are the best ones. So you recently wrote about one of these studies from the National Bureau of Economic Research on about giving cash benefits to parents of children. Specifically, one, it was about cash benefits, but it was about tied to whether that helps child welfare and development or not. What was the big research question and conclusion there?
Yeah, so the study itself is called Baby's First Years. And just from the outset, I mean, it's a very well done study, randomized control trials. So you randomly select some people to get this unconditional cash assistance, $4,000 per year, for actually, it's going to be for 6 or 7 years altogether. And then tracked, like, based on receiving that cash assistance, what was the impact on kids' development? And that a great array of ways to measure that in terms of brain activity and sort of cognitive skills more broadly, testing kids in different ways, under the belief that, if you just give people, especially families with kids, more cash assistance not tied to work or any parental behavior, that could have some impact on kids' outcomes in terms of their development. And so what the study found was that after 4 years of $4,000 per year of this unconditional cash assistance since birth, there was exactly zero impact on all these different measures of child development. And what I thought was notable is that the authors of the study, found this surprising. I mean, I think a lay observer would say,
Mhm.
okay, these are low income kids. They're from, probably difficult backgrounds. Just giving them $4,000 cash a year is probably not going to move the needle much. But I think there's this ingrained belief among many academics and also people on the left, that, cash is the thing that's holding back low income kids from thriving. And so I think there was surprise among the authors and many people that this didn't have the effect that they were expecting.
Well, yeah, and I feel like this is also, I don't know if this is a kind of like separate research interest, but the focus here on early childhood development is a sort of parallel theory about what, like, one, uh, providing more financial resources to a family helps them function better in general, but also that a lot of social science researchers think that the first few years of a child's life are especially unusually important, and if they have the right nutrition and stimulation and whatnot, that will set them up on the path to success in the future. So that, for example, providing extra cash assistance in their first 3, 4, 5 years of life will be dramatically more important than in their 15th, 16th, 17th year of life, right?
Yeah, and I actually think there is some good evidence that, what happens early on I mean, in utero, but especially when babies are born, and in their first years, can have a probably larger impact than it would have later in life. There's good research by Jim Heckman and many others, which find that in different contexts, certain types of things a little bit early on can have a bigger impact. To me, the distinction here is on whether that unconditional cash early on, or really at any time, is going to have those large impacts. And I think what we saw with this study is that $4,000 a year in cash didn't have that effect. But there's also other evidence. It's not like there's only been one study on the effect of assistance to families on kids' development. There's actually a lot of work. And in terms of like what's driving that, actually back in the 60s and 70s, we had a large expansion of the welfare state in terms of the SNAP, then the food stamp program, which has now been renamed Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. And what researchers found with that program is that given the low baseline material well-being of kids back in the 60s and 70s, that actually that's food stamps, that assistance actually did have some positive impacts on kids in terms of their later life outcomes. So something about that assistance, that nourishment, led to higher rates of employment and better impacts for kids down the line when they were grown up. The thing is, that was, half a century ago with lower baselines of material well-being. And so I think now in a modern world, I mean, fortunately, we've made lots of progress, and low income families and kids especially, we have a lot more, there's more market income going to these families, but also we have a larger safety net. And so we have a higher baseline of well-being. And so it's no longer the case that just providing material resources, it's what's going to drive these positive impacts for kids. It's more about development, the type of environment in which they're raised in, and maybe the examples of their parents in terms of displaying working behavior. And those seem to be the things today that are going to drive those positive impacts when those kids are, their current age, but also when they become adults.
So right, so before 1965, the poorer kids were poorer and the hungry kids were hungrier than they are now, relatively. So the question of, again, direct, as there's phrases that are used in the literature here and the policy analysis, like direct cash transfers, which just means giving people money. Seems to be this. The question is pretty polarizing, I feel like. So historically, most welfare programs were targeted at directly providing the thing that was considered the necessity, or like food stamps, or we call SNAP today, or shelter, subsidies for housing. Those are the most essential things. So we're going to give you food and shelter, but we're not just going to give you cash because the perennial attitude is, well, we don't want these poor people spending it on drugs and alcohol or things that we don't approve of. So we're going to make sure that we give them the thing they need, not cash they might or might not spend on the thing that we think they should want. Uh, but today, probably as much as any, you could tell me, but I feel like as much as any other time, there's a lot of anti-poverty advocates who say, no, 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 that's the wrong way to do it. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of resources. It's disrespectful of the recipient's agency and personhood. Just give them cash, let them spend it on, at whatever level of funding we have, just make it as much cash as possible and push it out the door. Are they right?
Yeah, well, no, but I think there's been an interesting evolution here in terms of how politically this issue is treated. I mean, so back in, say, like the 1980s, we had cash welfare, which did not have work requirements. It was called the um, AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children. And people started seeing in the 80s that there were problems with providing unconditional cash assistance, that it seemed like there were lots of single moms with kids who were not going to work, perhaps based on this large level of cash welfare not tied to any expectations. And then we had welfare reform in the 1990s, which, I mean, was driven by Republicans in Congress, but was signed into law by President Bill Clinton at the time.
Right.
It was very controversial. But what we learned from that, and which I think at the time left and right both learned, is that when they did that, when they put on requirements and time limits on the cash welfare, they also expanded tax credits that are tied to work, the earned income tax credit in particular, and to a lesser extent, the child tax credit. Both required earnings to receive them. what you saw was a dramatic increase in employment among single moms. So first of all, proving that these single moms actually could work when they were expected to. But then in later research, what we found was that it's actually really good for the kids. They had really big impacts in terms of their test scores and those future lifetime outcomes in terms of their employment, less incarceration, less welfare dependency when they were adults. And in the early 2000s, and there's research coming out, and people started to realize, holy cow, like this actually was a dramatic experiment. Not everyone thought it would work out well, but it did work out well. And I think we learned that for a while, and for a while, most of the calls on expanding assistance were around Medicaid for kids, which I think there's a lot makes sense to me. There's also calls to expand the earned income tax credit from the left, which has a cost, but at least it's tied to work. But then sort of over the past, I don't know, decade or so, I think people are forgetting those lessons. Today, essentially everyone on the left is calling for basically going back to pre-welfare reform, where we
Mhm.
provided cash assistance to families without conditions. And actually, we enacted it for 1 year in 2021 under the Biden administration. We turned the child tax credit, which you don't get it if you don't work. You do get it if you do work. They
Mhm.
changed that. They basically eliminated that, said we're not going to have this work incentive tax credit anymore. Instead, it's just going to be a child allowance that everyone gets based on the number of kids they have, and regardless of whether the parents work. And they increased the amount substantially to up to $3,600 per kid per year. And we did it for a year, and we were one vote away in the Senate actually from continuing that on for future years. And ever since, I mean, that's been a big part of the platform on the left, to kind of bring that back. And so I'm not really sure what's driven that. I mean, it's sort of the pandemic, I think, kind of was a big chance to just try something bold,
Mhm.
and kind of, I think, change society in some ways. But I hope that studies like the one that we mentioned with this baby's first year studies, that like bring us back to reality, that we've tried unconditional cash assistance in the past. There were worry it didn't really work right then. We changed it. We had big success. Like, it's a big risk to kind of go back to where we were.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the things that I kind of gets forgotten about when people are talking about whether we can, we as a society, the U.S. federal government or taxpayers can afford to have a more or less generous policy on something like a child tax credit, is the some of those kind of like behavioral effects that conservative anti-poverty people have been, talking about ever since, the 80s, that there uh, are negative downstream effects on things like marriage and family formation to certain kinds of welfare policies, that where the question is, well, should we spend 100 billion or 120 billion dollar a year? It almost doesn't matter, right? You would be willing to spend more if the outcomes were better, but they're not. And these are, but but because they're about things like marriage and family, they tend to be things that conservatives think are valuable and that maybe progressives think are less valuable, because they don't want to be uh, put into a patriarchal traditional box or whatever. And so, how does your thinking about any one of these like particular questions about particular social welfare spending? How does that have to do with what, again, conservatives, people at AEI, for example, have been talking about for a long time, like the so-called success sequence of expecting, of seeing just in reality that people are more successful when they say, A, get an education, then they get married, then they have children, and they do it in that order and not the other way around. Um, do we need to talk more about that?
I mean, I think so, and I think it's important to keep in mind, right, that it's not like there's only like a child tax credit that could become a child allowance. We have a large safety net, from Medicaid to SNAP to housing assistance to childcare assistance, disability insurance, including those that to disabled kids, which has grown a lot. We have cash welfare. And so when I think a lot of people look at some of these programs, they say, okay, we already have a large safety net, which does cost a lot of money. but also has some perverse incentives around already in it in terms of employment and marriage. And increasingly, there's, I think, a focus on marriage. I think we've done a lot to improve employment in the past few decades, especially with welfare reform. But there's been maybe less paid attention paid to the dissolution of the family and what impact that has. Fortunately, there's been more attention paid to that. And I think, when people look at the safety net, I and many of, I think my colleagues would say, like, yeah, we think there should be a safety net. Like, we don't think that kids who are born into poverty and their parents don't work should get nothing. But we're paying attention to this full picture of what already exists in the safety net, its costs, surely its fiscal cost, but also these how that affects family formation and employment in general, sort of thriving in society, including the impacts on the kids themselves. And I think you look at the situation and you still, you saw actually I mean, until welfare reform, you were seeing an increase in single parent families, although that actually sort of leveled off after welfare reform. It's still at a very, high level, but it hasn't gotten worse. But I think you want to see improvements. You want to see a system that provides that temporary assistance so people need it, but you don't want to inadvertently make it so people are less likely to get married because of penalties in the tax code, or because you're sending messages that marriage just isn't really needed in today's society. And that's a tough, I mean, that's a tough thing for public policy, I think, to touch. I mean, to really change. I mean, certainly we should recognize the ways in which public policy is, inadvertently penalizing marriage, and I'm all for trying to address those penalties in a reasonable, cost-effective way. But I also think we need to recognize that a lot of this stuff is cultural, and it's hard for public policy on its own to really to touch those. I mean, I think it's important to send some of these messages. I know those who talk about the success sequence. It's not just like it's an empirical like observation about the data.
Mhm.
People who don't do those three things in order are very unlikely to end up in poverty. But I think it's more of a message that people think it's important to send to real people, that like this is sort of common sense, but like it's important for people to have sort of a set of things that are achievable, and that if you do those, you're unlikely to be in poverty, and not just not be in poverty, but having a job is important for its own sake. Being married, like, that brings a lot of joy, and that brings a lot of important platform for success for kids. So like
Mhm.
there's just a lot of ways in which these lessons are sort of lost, and so sort of bringing the conversation back to, yes, some short-term relief to material hardship, but like these are the bigger goals, and how do we do the best we can to not penalize those things, and to say the things we need to say to make sure at least it's known that those are some of the goals that we have as a society.
Well, yeah, and I think you make a great point about uh, when we talk about any particular program, like the child tax credit, for example, we kind of have to remember that it exists in a much like wider ecosystem of all sorts of other programs that function at the federal, state, and even local level. And I think it's one of the common themes, I think, of a lot of people on, again, the sort of progressive left side of this debate, that the U.S. is horribly stingy with its payments and programs for the poor, and that other countries supposedly do much better, whether countries in the EU or the Nordic countries, they're more generous and support their citizens better. But and I'm certainly willing to admit there may be smarter ways to spend the money we're currently spending, but I'm skeptical of the argument that that Americans in general are horribly stingy with social welfare policy, because I think if you look at people like Robert Rector at the Heritage Foundation, he's written a lot about this. He said, I think this is in 2021, that the average poor family with children receives $65,000 in cash, food, housing, medical care, and education support from the taxpayers every year. So if you add everything together, it's quite considerable, right? Um, and I don't know if maybe there's a sort of technical research question where if you compare just what the US federal government spends to what, say, France's government spends, and you forget about all the state level spending, which other countries don't always have big state level, the equivalents that are spending tons of money, maybe that's sort of, sort of skewing these, international comparisons. But what, what do you think about this idea that, the US is, uniquely stingy among first world countries when it comes to social welfare?
Yeah, and I've seen both that argument that we're uniquely stingy and that we have a uniquely high child poverty rate. I mean that's a concern that's echoed, including like the National Academy of Sciences and sort of taken as gospel truth in among many academics. In terms of whether we're stingy, I mean we're spending over $1 trillion on the safety net. A lot of that's in Medicaid, and that's actually one thing that makes it hard to compare across countries. A lot of countries in most countries in Europe provide sort of healthcare as sort of a universal single payer model. We provide it through the safety net, largely through Medicaid and CHIP. So I mean, there's some different ways in which those dollars are spent, but we certainly spend a lot of money on assistance. It's also not the case that as some of these reports say, that we're like ranking near the bottom in terms of child poverty. It's not true. A lot of times people like to use relative poverty measures. So it certainly is the case that the United States has a much higher standard of living than the vast majority of countries in Europe is, and all of them that are large. Or some smaller countries that are very low GDPs that may have a slightly higher GDP per capita. But in terms of GDP per capita, we're substantially higher, have a higher standard of living. And so if you sort of use this relative poverty metric, then sure, like the median income is lower in most of Europe, and therefore it's sort of easier to be out of relative poverty in Europe. It's just that we accept the fact that we have a higher standard of living and a higher median income. And so, like, yeah, we have, based on a relative poverty measure, we'd have a higher rate than some of those countries. But if you sort of compare people in terms of their absolute well-being, we'd be much more closer to the top. Again, it depends how you value some of these benefits. But certainly you should account them in some way. I mean, we have refundable tax. If you just look at our sort of our official poverty measure, which a lot of people use to sort of cite like high rates of child poverty. I know there was this UN special report that was done maybe a decade ago, which was just used all these silly statistics. But like our official poverty measure doesn't even include any of the in-kind transfers we provide, like food stamps, housing assistance, or Medicaid. It doesn't include some of the biggest changes we've had in the safety net, like refundable tax credits, which provides, the earned income tax credit provides something like $7,000 or $8,000 to a family with a couple of kids. The child tax credit, which is a refundable portion, provides another, say almost $5,000 if you have 3 kids. So these things really add up, and Robert Rector, I think, has done that accounting quite well. And so we are providing a lot of assistance. I mean, you can argue about the best ways to provide it. I think it makes sense to cover kids with Medicaid, because kids is actually shown to have pretty important effects on their health. But in terms of some of these other programs, we need to be, maybe housing assistance isn't the best way to provide assistance to families, which actually just subsidizes rents in supply constrained areas and drives up rents for everybody else. Maybe there's better ways to provide, education so that there's, more school choice, whether it's charter schools or vouchers. Maybe there's a big regulation problem, which I have a lot of sympathy with. I mean, there is a cost of living crisis and in many parts of the country, and a growing part because of our housing markets where we constrained supply. And as a result, it's super expensive to live in areas which tend to be the places with good opportunity for kids in terms of the schools, in terms of the parents, in terms of the wages they can garner a job. So I see us having a regulation problem, and which fuels a cost of living problem. But what we are doing a lot in terms of safety net spending, and someone can always argue that we should do more, but we should acknowledge what we're already doing.
Well, yeah, and I think you put your finger on one great angle that I've often thought of, which is that if we, increase social welfare spending, but then we're still measuring people's incomes and not including the value of that social welfare spending, that seems like we're kind of not acknowledging reality. And I think there's people on, again, sort of the progressive left side and even sort of like the populist right side, where they've said, oh, well, we should be doing more to support families, and then we do more. Taxpayers spend more money on social programs, but then we don't include the value of all that money that's being spent in their social welfare calculation, and they say, oh, well, we're still not doing enough. It's like, well, yes, if you don't count what we did before, then maybe we're still not doing enough. And so, you mentioned the earned income tax credit is sort of one of the biggest sort of, broadly speaking, success stories, right? Which is it's tying social support to work, and there's been studies have shown there advantages to that, in ways that, again, this most recent study did showed a sort of null effect, did not show advantages from that unconditional cash transfer experiment. Um, but whenever I read about the EITC, someone always said, well, it has the highest fraud rate of any of the like social welfare programs or any of the, if not any federal program ever. And that there is, it's hard to say for sure, because if we knew 100% for sure there was fraud, we would presumably not be sending those checks out. But the estimates that there is a lot of claimed fraud. Um, and it seems pretty obvious that one of the reasons for that is that the only way to get zero fraud is to have zero benefits, right? If you make it so strict that no one can ever claim a benefit, then you can make sure you have no fraud. But if you want not to tie down people into constant repetitive paperwork, then you have to sort of accept maybe there will be some fraud around there. And I just wonder, where are we on the optimization curve of EITC? Should we get stricter to get the fraud down, or should we not worry about that because it's the cash for people who actually do deserve it? It's too important.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to think about it. I'm willing to accept some fraud or payments in order to have a benefit that's been shown to work. I mean, they're certainly it's basically the IRS delivering social assistance to low income families. Like the IRS was not really designed to do that because these are, refundable tax credits, right? So these are families who have, in large part, no federal income tax liability. We're getting a check from the federal government for, say between $6,000 to $7,000 or $8,000 in a year. And it's a lot of the times it's, parents who are not necessarily married who share a kid, right? So like there's a single mom who has a kid, but say she doesn't work enough to qualify or to get the maximum credit, but maybe the dad could. And so then he could claim the kid, even though the kid's not really living with him for the whole year. The kid potentially could get claimed by multiple parents or even potentially someone who's not a parent. So there's ways to sort of game the system, and that does happen given that this is a pretty big financial incentive. So I think those are legitimate concerns that people have about some of these mispayments and sometimes outright fraud. And I think it's worth investing some amount into that, into some, maybe that's increased auditing. But at the same time, like I wouldn't go really far and say, look, let's just scrap the program altogether. I wouldn't go to that 0 point just because this is a program. It doesn't have the bureaucracy, the red tape. We've seen actually with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that, I mean, I think there were some very encouraging things done in terms of work requirements for SNAP, for food stamps, and for Medicaid. They do require bureaucracy, right? Like, and I'm willing to live with that. I think those are worthwhile trade-offs to make, but it's going to take some, state spending. You're going to have, people falling through the cracks who should get it, who otherwise don't get the benefits. It's just like a waste of time if I have to deal with the government bureaucracy to verify my eligibility when I'm already working and maybe busy, with raising my kids and engaging in work. So I think there's some benefits that we get from making this a tax credit that just gets delivered through the tax code that automatically is going to have some of these negative trade-offs in terms of, some of the higher rates of mispayment and fraud. So I wouldn't poo-poo it. I think those are a big deal. These are taxpayer funds that we want to go to the right people in the right amounts. But I definitely would not say let's just scrap the program altogether. I think modest efforts are where I probably land.
All right. And so I'm wondering again, sort of pulling back, looking at this big picture in terms of sort of bang for the buck on reforms you think should be adopted. Where do we, if you get called into Congress and they're like, "Sir, we need your recommendations right now, and we're going to base a major welfare reform bill on what you tell us in the next 15 minutes." Uh, what is going to be at the top of your list? So that could be big, like national changes in federal programs, or sometimes in some of these federal programs, they're administered by the states, and the federal government can grant waivers to let states do things in different ways. So is there any big like structural change you would have, or there are things that you would want to let states experiment more with?
Yeah, I have two answers. One that's kind of cheating, and then one maybe real answer. The cheating one, which actually has a negative cost, is just deregulation of housing, and that's something the federal government can't really do.
Mm,
But one thing they could do is there's actually a lot of federal land out in the western part of the country. And Senator Lee is from Utah has really pushed this idea that why don't we just sell off some of this federal land, let developers get it, and they could build more housing. That would reduce cost of living, allow more people to live to some of these higher opportunity areas and actually get money for the to the treasury. So that would add a negative cost. So I think that would be great. And localities should do a lot more deregulation and do more experimentation with more school choice, all that stuff. In terms of like real safety net spending, I think the program with the most where it's most fruitful for reform would be rental housing assistance program. We've done a lot in terms of SNAP, especially with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, in terms of more work requirements and actually enforcing the ones that are on the book. With Medicaid, we've kind of taken baby steps on work requirements with the same bill, and I think those are all well and good. But housing assistance has not really been part of the conversation. We actually spend more on housing assistance, rental housing assistance, something like $50 billion a year. That far now exceeds what we spend on cash welfare. It's not as high as SNAP, but it's kind of right at right in the kind of third place after Medicaid, SNAP, and you kind of got that housing assistance. And so I think there's a lot to do there. It's a really unfair system where most people who are eligible actually don't get the benefits. There's these waiting lists and then lotteries, and you could be on the waiting list for 10 years and still never get it, especially in high demand places like New York City. Meanwhile, the people who do get on, it's sort of a benefit for life. You get on it and you can stay on it as long as your income stays somewhat low. But because fair market rents are so high in some of these supply constrained areas,
mhm.
it's really hard to lose. Even if your income goes up a little bit, you're still going to be getting the benefit. And so that's not good. It's not a good way to provide assistance. That's unfair. It sort of ties people to a certain place because like you don't want to lose your voucher or your public housing. And so then it's a big disincentive for sort of mobility and moving to where maybe there's more jobs or where your kids can, have a better educational experience. So I think it's a really inefficient way to provide assistance. So if I could do anything, I would completely transform that program. I think it makes sense to have sort of a temporary housing safety net if people are at risk of eviction or falling into homelessness. Certainly, we want to provide sort of some prevention assistance, maybe some, 6 months to a couple years of like a rental subsidy to stabilize them as they get back on their feet. I think that's all well and good, but beyond that, I would say time limits. I think it doesn't make sense to have someone on for those who are non-disabled and working age. We're not going to just have it as open-ended thing. Maybe it's a time limit of it's 2 years or at least maybe 5 years. You could experiment with some work requirements. So I would say if I would actually be ready to make some national changes, but as a first step, I think certainly letting states experiment with ways of having time limits, work requirements for certain populations, so that we can spread assistance around and make it more inclined towards upward mobility as opposed to just staying fixed in place for a long time.
All right, Kevin. Well, thank you so much. This has been excellent. Before we go, tell people where they can find all of your stuff online.
Yeah, so aei.org, search Kevin Corinth, and you'll find all of my my work, my reports, and interviews like this one.
All right. Excellent. Thanks again for being with us, Kevin.
Thank you. Appreciate it.